Okay, I'm here with Stan Karp from the Education Law Center. Stan, the project that's going on today is pretty much something that is focusing in on what type of organizing that's going on in the community involved with the education funding situation. What state is it in at the present time?
Well, the funding issues are really before the Supreme Court right now. The funding framework for the urban districts in New Jersey for about 25 years has been connected to the Abbott versus Burke case. Last year, the state passed a new school funding formula that it wants to replace those remedies and those mandates coming out of the Abbott case. And the advocates at the Education Law Center are concerned that there are some programs and protections that are not covered or funded by the new law, and so they've gone back to court to make sure that the guarantees in Abbott are protected in the new funding system.
So from the relationship in terms of how the approach is basically in terms of the organizing, the activism, is pretty much centralized around the Abbott decision?
Well, I think especially for a group like the Statewide Education Organizing Committee, they're concerned with getting out the word and making sure that the state is aware that they're concerned about the impact of the new formula, what it's going to mean in schools, what it's going to mean for kids. There are a lot of other issues connected with this. I, for example, work a lot on the secondary reform issues, which are dealing with some other mandates and programs coming down not directly connected with the funding. But in terms of the funding, what the organizing here today is about is making sure that the new school funding arrangement still guarantees adequate funding for a thorough and efficient education for kids in urban districts.
When we talk about thorough and efficient education, we find that there are a number of inadequacies in relationship to the approach in relationship to how they're teaching the kids. Mm-hmm. Is that something that kind of like jives into the situation with the funding process?
Yeah, it's a very complicated issue. Money is necessary but insufficient for a good education. And so it's important to make sure that the resources, the staff, the support programs are in place, but it doesn't stop there. You need accountability procedures, you need parent involvement for accountability, you need teacher engagement and teacher professional development. And the only way to find out if the money is really getting to the kids and making a difference is to make sure the funding streams are in place and then to make sure you're actually being very transparent and monitoring what's happening in schools and classrooms.
Well, the streamlining of the funding process seems to want to take the transparency approach, or in effective relationships to how they're dealing with the funding, is to say, well, you're really not using it where you say you're using it. Is that really the case?
Well, there have been some problems. I mean, and one of the reasons that the state came up with specific mandates in the Abbott case is that for years the Supreme Court asked the state of New Jersey, can you tell us what programs, what things have to be in place to guarantee a thorough and efficient education? And the state never really wanted to define that. They never really wanted to answer that question. Because if they gave an answer that required a lot, they would be required to deliver it. If they gave an answer that didn't require all the programs, they would have to explain why the most successful districts in New Jersey were spending quite a bit more than the urban districts. So they basically ducked the question. And when they ducked the question, this is when the court said, well, and what they did was, this is back in the 90s, they remanded the case to a judge, and they said, do an investigation, do some research, what are the programs that kids need? And that's when they came back with the mandates for early childhood education, for supplemental instruction in summers and after school, for supplemental funding so that districts could request more money if they needed for specific programs, for security guards. These were all the specifics in the Abbott case that ELC is concerned shouldn't be lost in the new funding formula.
Now, in regard to how the federal relationship is involved, No Child Left Behind, the different types of procedures that have been created, and some that have been having a hard time to meet, does it seem as there is a legal approach towards competitiveness in educational requirements?
Well, the federal No Child Left Behind Act is a very different framework than Abbott. Abbott is basically about identifying needed programs and providing the resources for them. No Child Left Behind is basically about identifying test score gaps, and then the remedies that they put in place, it doesn't bring funding or strategies to eliminate the gaps. The main remedies, if a school is not meeting the NCLB benchmarks, are to transfer kids out of the school or to provide supplemental tutoring sometimes to private companies. This doesn't necessarily address the capacity needs in the school. the framework for the federal law right now doesn't work to really build the local capacity you need to address the problems that are being identified.
How does the impact of the movement towards school vouchering come into effect?
Well, the main issue around school vouchers is whether or not you're going to use public funds to subsidize the transfer of public school students out to private schools. And the problem with that is, first, a practical one. There simply aren't enough placements in private schools to provide alternatives for the public school population. So you're talking about only subsidizing the transfer of a few privileged people who get to leave schools that are troubled, take resources, students, and parents away from those schools, and leave many kids behind. The other problem is that most private schools will not accept large numbers of poor kids or special education kids or English language learners. So vouchers are more like a political position to bring a kind of market reform to schools. They really don't provide the resources or alternatives to the problem, the very real problem of low-performing schools in poor districts.
The impact of today's workshop, what do you think is going to come out of it?
Well, I hope that the impact will be another group of very committed parents with a better understanding of issues like funding. This afternoon we'll be taking up the secondary reforms, which also have a big impact on graduation rates and dropout rates, and that these parents will then work in their communities to increase the level of understanding of these issues and have more parents show up at schools, show up at school boards, show up at state forums in order to advocate for their kids.